to have not read Sara Paretsky, I realized today, was that would have missed one of the singularly important achievements, I think, in writing today. I would say that Sara Paretsky not only changed the way we read, but the way we perceive of people. In 1982, I just want to check the date, with her introduction of investigator VI Warshawski, I think she shook up the genre, I was going to say the gender, of crime writing and changed things in the mystery world in a way that now we pretty much maybe take for granted, we hope. Today, even my mother knows who VI Warshawski is. And Sara Paretsky's books are published in 30 different countries. Her latest book, by the way, Brushback, which I believe is here for sale, it is. And as I always say to people, buy a book, one of those things that is disappearing, and get Sara to sign it. It was named one of the best thrillers of the year. So after many years of writing these books, the books have continued to be terrific, getting better. This is one, I have to say I'm only halfway through this, so you'll forgive me.
Well, I can tell you how it comes out.
No. See what we were in for? I was going to say up for. Okay. Just want to end with, before we start to talk, a couple of the things. The Gold Dagger for Best Novel for Blacklist. The British crime writers Cartier Diamond Award for Lifetime Achievement. And for Founding Sisters in Crime, Ms. Magazine named her Woman of the Year. I remember having that issue of Ms. Magazine, which was very important to my wife and many women at that time. I think since you transformed the role of women in crime fiction, and I know it's been a while, but can you tell us how VI Warshawski was born and created?
I've been reading crime fiction since I was in my early teens. It was the big literary form in my household in rural, I can't say rural, in Kansas farm country where I grew up. And it wasn't until I was in my early 20s that I really started reading noir fiction. When I encountered Chandler, it was at the time that second wave feminism was first really starting to come into its own. And it struck me hard that in 6 of Chandler's 7 books, it's a woman who presents herself in a sexual way who is the villain. And then the more I began to read and think, the more I began to see that was really normative for so-called golden age or cozy, don't like that word, fiction too. In the Peter Wimsey novels, a woman who's been widowed or divorced is tainted. She won't be a villain, Agatha Christie, the same thing, but her moral standards are questionable because she has sexual experience. So this made me cranky. And I wanted to create a woman, Private Eye, who altered that image. But I didn't have a sense of myself as a writer, and maybe that makes me a good person to talk to a group of people who include those who are aspiring writers as well as probably those who are actively published. It took me about 8 years of false fits and starts to really actually find the character and find the voice to write about her with.
Yeah, I had noted that you had talked about those 8 years from conceptualizing VI Warshawski until you actually finished that. And I wondered,
well, I didn't actually conceptualize VI. What I had
of
was a woman Private Eye, and what I had, which was a really bad idea, unworkable and would have not been very interesting, was a parody of Marlowe. I had a really hard-boiled detective named Minerva Daniels. She drank cheap bar whiskey. She smoked, and I've never smoked. And I would say that do not give your characters a habit that you don't know how to. And it wasn't until I was working as a marketing manager for a large insurance company in Chicago and was part of the wave of women to enter management professions in large numbers. We'd always been there as a presence, but not the huge presence that we became in the 70s. And there were some guys who were just wonderful bosses and mentors, and I learned a lot from them. And then there were some pills who really resented our being there. And I was working for one of these guys, and I was in a meeting with him, and my lips were saying, "Gosh, Fred," as I call him, my one act of discretion, that I don't use his real name in order to avoid libel and slander suits. My lips were saying, "Gosh, Fred, heck of an idea," and the balloon over my head was saying something really unrepeatable. And really, literally, VI came to me in that moment. I thought, not Philip Marlowe and drag, but a woman like me and my friends doing a job that hadn't existed for us when we were growing up or in school, taking some of the crap that we had to take, but she hadn't been raised in rural Kansas to be a nice girl, not make waves, and she didn't care if she was fired. And so that was really her genesis.
And so during those 8 years, and because I know there are writers in the room, but those false starts and the way you proceeded, so it took you a lot of that time to actually find that character, to understand who that character was, to find the story. All of those various things were happening at the same during those 8 years, or.
And I also think the biggest thing for me was the confidence that I had a writing voice. That I had that. I think if I believed in that, I would have buckled down and done something, even if it hadn't been. Maybe it was good that for me, for my career, for the kind of things that you said about her being a game changer, that I did wait until that character came together for me. But I always think that you may have the brilliant talent of Shakespeare or tiny talent or no talent at all, but you need to have the confidence that you can get from beginning to end, and that was what I lacked.
Well, that's a hard thing. I mean, I think, I don't want to go into, we'll talk about that a little later, because I was thinking about how confident, sometimes one is very confident behind their computer typing and not so confident in the world, and those are two different things. You gain that confidence from working, right? And from, don't you? Beth?
Yes, although I have to say that
I'll read your own quote here too. This is my favorite, because I kind of like this. You said, speaking of confidence, I start each book convinced I can't do it. So how do you garner that confidence to go through the book and go through, are there 16? Warshawski plus 17.
I'm working on number 18.
Okay, so you've managed to get that confidence going in some way, past that initial feeling of I can't do this.
Yes, I think that David Remnick, he wrote an appreciation in the New Yorker for, I can't think of the man's name. He had won a Pulitzer Prize for a book that he'd written about Vietnam, had dried up for a number of years, had completed a book on a Montana miners' strike, and committed suicide when the book was in galleys. And Remnick said that there's a way in which every writer leaves a book, ends a book, feeling it's not so much completed as abandoned, and that everyone will see the places that you've taped and glued and used chewing gum to put it together. And I have to say that Lucas was the writer's name, I think Lukas, if I'm remembering. But it's not that it's the realization that many people go through this that kind of keeps me going, because I'm at the point in the current book where it's making me sick to my stomach. And when I'm sick to my stomach, I eat pints and pints of ice cream. So far from having a consumptive habit, when I'm feeling low in spirits, I tend to gain a few dress sizes. But it, and also you have to shut out. It's what Annie Lamott refers to as radio station, what is it, W fuck you? Where you hear every time your parents told you that you were stupid, Yeah, my father used to tell me when I would write little stories as a child that my work was derivative. I was 10 years old. I still hear him, I still see him, dead though he's been for 15 years, looking at that screen and saying, "Derivative, Sarah." This isn't my psychoanalyst's office, so I won't tell you the story of my father and the short story I wrote for a juvenile competition in the Atlantic.
Well, I was holding this delay, but you did write a memoir in which you did talk about a lot of those things. And just to, not that I'm trying to best you because it is your night, but before I went to art school when I was a kid, I would do drawings and stuff at night, and I'd put them up for my parents, and they'd come home and they'd write crits.
No way.
This is very good. No, it doesn't really look like that person. So anyhow.
How old were you?
10. Like that. But
It was
anyhow.
kind of derivative.
Well, yeah, it was derivative. They were kind of right. But anyhow, so I want to go back to VI Warshawski. And when you wrote that first book, did you have any idea of the kind of reception that would get and the importance that that book would take on? Or would it have paralyzed you to think about it?
It might have paralyzed me, but also I think, so I worked full time while I wrote the first 3 books, and then it was kind of a frightening jump off the high dive when I finally quit my day job. But I owed a lot to Stuart Kaminsky, who taught a class at Northwestern University in Chicago in their night school called Writing Detective Fiction for Publication. And I had written about 70 pages of what became Indemnity Only, and just thought, as I do now, that I don't know what I'm doing, and I signed up for the class, and Stuart, he liked the character. He had some great suggestions over things that I was doing that didn't work, anachronisms. I just needed to get into a more authentic voice. And he liked the fact that I have an MBA and that I had all this business background. He said that's a niche that isn't explored, so put your detective smack into the middle of financial crime. And but also, he just kind of held my hand until I got that first draft done, and that made a huge difference. I'm sorry, what was the question?
No, we're getting there. It's okay. No, in fact, I like that part better than my question because that applies to so many people here. But my question was, when you finished this, how the reception of what, the reception.
Oh, please, I had fantasies. I thought I was going to be Mary Higgins Clark, everybody was going to race out and buy this book. 3,500 people raced out and bought that book, and 2,500 of them were public libraries, and so I am forever indebted to the public libraries of the United States.
Well, what do you think, what changed that then about the attitude about that book and how it eventually made its way into the greater consciousness, we could say?
I think that a lot of it had to do with right voice at the right time. We were, 1982, the year my first book was published, was the first year that women in Chicago could be members of the regular police force instead of just matrons. I think New York did it in 81, as did San Francisco. There were, I've learned since, never mind, but don't write me and say, there were women police officers during the Second World War, because I know that. But officially, for the way that law and order was changing in this country, it was part of that zeitgeist. And Sandra Day O'Connor joined the Supremes a little bit, well, right around that same time. So I think that the urge that people had, that many women and a number of men as well had, to see women playing not just bigger roles on the stage, but it has to do with being able to solve your problems. And women always have had to solve their own problems, not to rely on a knight to come and rescue them, however much many of us may still daydream about that. But the way that fiction, at least in the West, treated women, starting with Eve and the apple, is that women were using their bodies to try to make good boys do bad things and had to be punished for doing that. Or if they were chaste, they couldn't tie their shoes without adult supervision. So I think there was a real hunger for seeing that not just being a detective, not just being able to be physical and be sort of in your face the way a Marlowe or a Spencer might have been, but to actually be a self-confident, problem-solving person whose sexuality had nothing to do with her moral character.
It's interesting because I was thinking when you're talking that I don't think of Chandler as actually a very realistic writer.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that VI Warshawski is a different kind of writing entirely. So that, it's funny, one of my first questions was, how did Raymond Chandler influence you? Because I knew that. But, you know, his kind of stereotypes that you were smashing apart, you didn't, I mean, here's the thing, when you think about something ahead of time, like what you're going to do, and then create it on the page, I mean, I'm trying to get to the point of like how you wrote that book with these ideas of, as you said before, you wanted really a woman who thought in the way of what you were experiencing in the world with Fred and that. So it's also that you wrote in the first person, which makes it harder for a reader to divide that character from you as a writer, though we know you're not an investigator. I'm not asking a good question here. What I'm trying to get to is, when you wrote that book, how conscious were you of breaking some rules, of creating this woman against the stereotype?
Yes, that was what I would say, very conscious of that, and that was kind of what was driving my carriage, so to speak, my chariot. I worked with a guy, I worked for CNA Insurance in Chicago, and one of my beloved male co-workers, I wish I knew what had become of him. He was 50, no, he was a sweetheart, I loved him. He was a 50-something industrial accident investigator who played ice hockey as a hobby, and he used to call me Queen Boadicea because he saw me as riding my chariot and cutting the wheels off the off the Romans around me. So I think that was very much in my mind. There were things that I think if I'd had greater confidence in exploring my own maybe interior and bringing it more to the page, I often think I would not have made her an orphan. I was following a lot of the structure of the hard-boiled novel out of insecurity of not about finding a market, which I knew nothing about then, but insecurity in not being able to complete the novel. And so I followed certain things formulaically to give me a structure that would get me through from beginning to end of the novel. And the big thing that I would do differently, maybe, is not make her an orphan, because the books where, like this one, where her dead family play a really central role are, I think, my best books, because there's a vivid dynamic among the characters. And VI's mother died when she was 16, so she never had to go through all those fights that you have with your mother as you're in your 20s and following your own path. Or maybe she wouldn't have, maybe they always would have remained close, but it would have given me more ways to push the character to think about different story options. So,
yeah, and yet you've been able to sustain her through these 17 novels. So how does one sustain a character through that kind of series, that length of series? I mean, for you particularly.
I think that I hate reading books where I feel like, however polished the writing is, there's no soul to it. And I'm not going to name names of people who I think write like that, but I will name a name of a Chicago writer, Michael Black, ex-cop, who I love his books. They're very rough. The English could be much more polished. I mean, they're rough in the sense that they, I wish that, I worked with him early in his, when he was starting out, and if I had the time and the energy, I'd do it now. But there's so much passion in his books, and the stories are so well thought out. And I would way rather read a book like that that's got heart in it than slick writing that has all the nuts and bolts of a Michael Chabon hyper-polished sentence, for instance. But Chabon certainly has plenty of heart, so I'm not naming a name of someone who I think does it wrong, but sometimes his English is so polished that I feel like I'm ricocheting off of it. But so I'd way rather read passion and heart than polish, and I try to keep that in my center as well.
Is that what you mean when I know I'm throwing your quotes at you, when you said that lack of commitment in a book makes it uninteresting?
Yeah.
Is that what you were talking about
Yes.
specifically when you say commitment, this kind of heart, or with this? But it's sort of not quite definable, in some ways. I mean, you can feel it, but
I think that everyone who writes crime fiction, not everyone, but most people, do it because they love the genre. And it seems as though it's something that is teachable, and to an extent it is. And I've taught and I've been taught. I mean, I got my start with Stewart writing detective fiction for publication. But
yeah, but I know where you're going. But the heart of that and the passion of the writer is what carries that.
Right.
Is what you're going to be
Yeah.
thinking. Sorry to finish.
no,
your
that's
sentence.
fine.
Because,
I was
just-
stumbling.
No, but I also want to. So I understand when you say that, because of course, I mean, anyone who's written knows when you reach a point and you're just writing, and you're not quite there, and it's when you should stop and do something else or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But so with keeping VI not just filled with heart, but you have to bring something new to her, really, in every book, in a way, to keep the reader. I mean, in a certain way, the reader comes back because they like her, and they want to see what she's going to do. So would you say then that what you do, because I don't think this is true of you, I was going to say, so you keep the character constant and you create a new plot, but no, because she evolves, right? And how do you do
Yeah,
that?
I don't know how to think about it consciously, and I think that's one reason why I start each book with a lot of terror, or get in the middle. At the beginning, my idea of a book is that starting a book is, my image is you're on a mountaintop, you have this idea, this story idea, you're on a mountaintop, and everything is clear, and you do a 360, and all these valleys, each one is enticing. And then you pick one and you start down the mountain, and then it's brambles and fog comes up and mire and mud, and you think, oh, I should go back to the top of the mountain. And I have done that. I've thrown out as much as 250 pages of a book that wasn't coming together right for me. But, now I've forgotten the question again.
No, it's just about VI and keeping her, how you plot versus
right,
your
I don't
character.
think that I think about it in a conscious way. It's putting her in motion, and the characters that she's reacting to that consciously or unconsciously keep her fresh. One of the things, when I started this series, I wanted her to age in real time. Well, I was 30, and the thought of being almost 70 as I am now, that was so remote as to be unimaginable. And my mother, who at that time was in her 50s, I thought, well, if mom only looked after herself, quit smoking, exercised more, we wouldn't have all this complaining about the body falling apart. You know, the evil eye lies in wait. You don't even have to say these things out loud. It just comes out of your head and whacks you. But it had always, I loved the early Spencer novels, and yet as time passed, Spencer remained forever 40 with his Korean War experience. And here's VI. She's very shaped by the fact that her mother was a refugee from fascist Italy, and her grandparents, her father's mother and father, worked the killing floors at the stockyards for $11 a week, their combined salary in 1930. And who she is was shaped by the great social justice movements of the 60s and 70s. So it's not realistic that she's not getting older, but I've decided I have to bite the bullet and stop aging her, because I want her, you know, when I'm 80, maybe 60 will start seeming like, you know, really youthful and vigorous. You know, I'm beginning to feel like 70 is the new 90.
You know, you said about two things, about looking down the mountain and choosing the path, and which leads me to a question, but you also said something about you've thrown out 250 pages. When Lee Child was here, people remember him saying he's never thrown out a page.
Well, what can I say?
He's very tall and confident. But so your process, is your process more intuitive as you go along, or do you outline some? How do you do that? I
would say that it's, I'm not sure if this is a word and if I'm pronouncing it right, it's accretive. So I start always almost always with the idea of a crime. I've sometimes started with a relationship, but the idea of a crime. And then I start imagining, and I know why it's been committed, because I'm sort of wedded to the white collar world or something not unlike that. And then I start imagining characters doing things. But until I have characters who are actually speaking, I can't see the story. The hardest, books have beginnings, middles, and ends, and each part is hard. The hardest thing to write well is a good ending, but the hardest part, at least for me, of a book is the beginning. And so the book that I'm working on now, well, Brushback, I had 7 different openings, maybe 50 pages, until I finally got to the story that was going to work for me. Brushback, some of the story is set against the backdrop of Chicago sports, Cubs baseball and Blackhawks hockey, and I wanted, in the worst way, to have a baseball player who was injured early a pro player, injured early in his career, be the catapult that would bring VI into the story. And I worked on it and worked on it and worked on it, and it just wasn't getting me anywhere close to the story. And finally, I realized, Boom Boom, VI's beloved dead cousin, who was a hockey star, his backstory plays a big role in Brushback. And I realized that rather than having 2 stars, what I needed was somebody from the old neighborhood who was resentful because he'd never had the gift or the career that Boom Boom did. And when I got to that point, then the story finally started unfolding. What I do is, I don't outline. For me, that's a death sentence. I tried it with my second book, and because I was scared and I thought, oh, they want a second book, that means that I'd better outline, because isn't that what writers do? And that was like a straitjacket, because for me, when characters start talking and come in motion, it opens storylines that I hadn't thought of. You know, everybody works differently. There's no right way to write. It's the wonderful thing about writing is that the way that works for you is the right way to do it, not the way that works for me. Or P.D. James was an obsessive outliner. I'm sure many of you know that she would say that she outlined at such a level that she would write the chapter she was in the mood for on a given day. But you know, that worked for her, and it doesn't work for me. So I like having things unfold and characters do things. I'm not going to say that they take on a life of their own. They don't. They're coming out of my mind. But I'm not a chess player. I only see one move ahead. I don't see 6 moves ahead.
Oh, I like that. That's sort of Yale doctoral, only seeing so far as the fog in the front of your headlights. But so that's a new one. And I like the idea. It's interesting how everybody does do it differently. Jeffrey Deaver was here. And he showed me at 4 black loose leaf binders of outline for one book.
Well,
And I said, what happens if something you write a scene and it doesn't work? He said, why would I do that? So, you know, but I was very envious because I think in a way that sounds great to have that whole outline, but I can't imagine it. But so.
But I want to just say
Yeah,
one other
please.
thing on what I do as the book starts maturing and I start having questions about where I'm going with it. I work with big artist sketch pads, and I outline what I've done, and then I can see things that need fixing, and it also helps signpost me to where I need to go.
Yeah, we've been talking about that so much. I wanted something you said about the beginning. So you find the beginning later, in a way. You said you had 7 different beginnings. And it was because then the book starts to tell you more about itself. So then you go back to that. Is that what you were saying? And I wondered also about your history background. Since you have don't you have a PhD in?
I do.
In history? So what does that do for your work? I mean, does that give you a kind of discipline for your work, or is it something, you know,
I don't know which came first, the obsession with accurate research or the PhD. You know, I don't know if I did the degree because I was obsessed with getting it right, or if the degree made me more. So I make tons of mistakes, and people write me, and I'm, you know, as long as they write me in a nice way, I'm happy to hear from them because I learn from having, you know, even factual mistakes. And of course, I always knew that touching baseball would be a mistake. Like, you write about insurance and people are like, you write about baseball. So I've started getting letters from readers telling me mistakes I've made, but you know, they've been nice. They've been nice about it. And I don't think people realize that I myself had a career in baseball. In my rural Kansas days, I played third base in our rural league, Kaw Valley District 95. This is a really important anecdote because the school that always beat us, and we, you know, this was before Title IX, Title VII, all those things, but to get 9 people on the field, girls and boys played. We were always beaten by Wakarusa number 6. Who, I think they redshirted their 8th graders. It was like they were 25-year-olds. But this is worth noting because that is the school that Rex Stout went to. So I'm thinking, God, guy beats me all the time. It's like, but anyway, so I played third base. I had a very powerful arm for a 12-year-old. I had a cousin, sadly dead, New Yorker, actually, in my New York family, who did not want me throwing like a girl and trained me to throw hard and far. The trouble is I had no aim, and we had one baseball. And a lot of times we spent our entire recess hunting through the cornfields around the school for that baseball. My teammates hated it when I fielded the ball. And my lifetime batting average was .017, which until this season had me set up perfectly to be a Cubs fan.
now we can have at the baseball moment, you know, we can have the audience ask some questions of Sarah. Unless there aren't, I have a zillion. Oh yeah, Anne.
I have a question. To go back to the beginning, 1982 or so, I'm curious whether your publisher, and I don't remember who the first one was, whether they realized, or your editors, whether they realized that there was something wonderfully different about VI and your book, or was it really just the right voice at the right time, like you said?
I had a hard time getting published.
Did
and
they promote you, in other words?
I was
Something
very
new.
lucky to be starting out at a time when there were still about 40 independent houses in New York. Because it took a year and they had all turned me down, and then the Dial Press, I don't think that it had nothing to do with that. It had to do with the fact that the junior editor who was looking at the slush pile that day had spent her summers in Chicago, and it revived her nostalgia for Chicago. So I got turned down. My rejection letters covered things like the fact that it was derivative, that nobody wanted to read about private eye novels. My favorite rejection letter, which I think was from Simon & Schuster, I can't remember, said that not enough people read in the upper Midwest to make it profitable to publish a book set in Chicago. I know.
They always have a reason, don't they? But it only takes one. I always say that it only takes Suzanne.
Did you encounter much hostility starting out with this revolutionary character, and from quarters perhaps that you might not have expected it?
You know, it's hard to answer that question because I don't have a lot of feedback from the early days. The hostility that I really experienced like a forest fire in the face was when I started Sisters in Crime. And then the attacks were just ferocious, and some of them were very much like what you read about with women who are trying to take on video games, except I was lucky it was fanzines, not internet and blogs. But I mean, my physical appearance was attacked. I had a pointy nose and eyes that slashed and burned, one person said. Which is actually, I didn't realize this, but my stepsons, I never fought with them, but they told me recently, they said, you would get this death look in your eyes. And I thought, oh, maybe the guy who wrote that essay about me was right. Maybe my eyes really were lethal weapons.
So do you think that Sisters in Crime just posed a threat to male writers
Yeah.
at the time?
Well, it seemed very threatening to significant players in the industry too, who one woman who served early on the steering committee got a call saying she would never be published again if she agreed to work on the steering committee. I don't know who called her, but she was pretty shaken. And there was a lot of that, and the article that I was just talking about, Bill Brashler wrote it for the Chicago Tribune Sunday magazine back when the Tribune was an actual newspaper, and basicly said that I was a censor who wanted to take male books out of bookstores. So there was a lot of fear and insecurity. So I don't know if that also if there was an element of that in reaction to VI or not. I can't really answer that. Your question was, did I get it from unexpected sources? After Indemnity Only was published, I had a letter from a woman saying that it wasn't right that VI should talk back to men without getting beaten up for it. So I found that profoundly disturbing because it said a lot about the situation she was living in. But I was afraid to write back and say, the National Domestic Violence Hotline. I thought that might trigger even more violence in her home life, assuming that I was reading the situation correctly.
Sort of almost a silencing question, isn't it? I mean, the way it's interesting. I mean, to think of how many also now what happened after that, and so many amazing women. One who just was there waving to you, S.J. Roseanne, and so many women crime writers. It's funny because I guess I wasn't aware of that at that time. So.
But on the other side of it was just how moving it was for me to know how many women felt empowered by it. I mean, when my books are published in Japan, and I once got just a raft of letters from Japanese women. They call the whole series their Vic. And one woman said, I read Vic before I go to work. She was an engineer at Hitachi. She gives me strength to deal with what I face on the job. One woman said, Vic helped me have the courage to buy a washing machine so that I didn't have to wash my baby's diapers by hand. You know, it just seems so moving to me. Probably most of all, you know, Chicago was steel country until the late 80s, and and VI grew up in the neighborhood where the steel industry was. And a group of women, wives of out-of-work steel workers, came to one of my events one night, and they stayed after. There were 10 of them, to tell me that they had not read a novel since they graduated from high school, and then they heard that the books were set partly in their neighborhood, and that VI gave them courage to deal with this very hard hand that life had dealt them. And I'm telling you, you don't get an award that means as much as that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just have like a more general question I wrote down. How can we as artists and writers maintain our credibility without limiting its access points? And how can that benefit something more inclusive while keeping its approach and standards exclusive?
I'm sorry, the
That's
first
more
part of your
general.
question was how can we as artists,
How can we maintain our credibility without limiting its access points?
I'm not sure I understand.
What do you mean by
I think
access
it's
points?
Well,
Exactly.
just like kind of just making work like more accessible. Like how can we kind of aim for that as I don't know. I'm just sorry.
No, yeah.
You mean writing or painting or whatever your art is in a way that people can understand and respond to, or writing in a way that makes it more marketable? Because both of those have to do with access.
Well, just like more inclusive as in just how it gets kind of like where like who it reaches, like what your audience, like kind of who your audience is, and how those questions kind of affect like.
I think that it's always a tough balancing act between your vision and, well, making the vision accessible. You know, you could write only for yourself, and it might not be something that anyone else wanted to read or hear, but you're maintaining total integrity. And of course, I mean, I'm human. I want to be a bestseller. I want lots of people to read my books. I used to think I wanted to be the McDonald's of the book world. You know how they used to put 93 billion? I thought, I don't care if they read the book as long as they buy the book. I mean, I have those moments, but I think that it goes back to, you have to be doing it for yourself first, not for the market or the impact on the market. You know, I took a break from VI twice to do standalone novels, which weren't very successful commercially, but they were things that I really wanted to write. They had And maybe they weren't successful commercially because they weren't very good. Maybe they weren't successful commercially because people wanted VI and they weren't VI, or, we're in a very corporate kind of phase in our lives. The small town that I grew up near used to be a great center for artisans, lots of independent crafts people of all kinds there. But as it's become a sort of a sleeper suburb of Kansas City, people only want the chains now, and so the independent artisans are kind of being muscled out. So I think, it's a disease, I think, that's affecting us these days, and hopefully we'll get over it where.
But I just want to say that I think one of the most important things that Sara has said is that you can't, it's very hard to write, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, with the idea of this will be accessible to this person or this group of people. I mean, you are trying to write what you write and what to be true to yourself, and hopefully that will hit. It will strike an emotional chord or resonate with other people in some way. That's all you can hope for, I think, right? In some way.
Yeah, I always think that writing it's a form of auto surgery. The more honest you can bring yourself to be, the deeper you can cut to the bone. It's going to answer that question. It will be accessible to people because it's honest. And I mean, we just celebrated Shakespeare's 400th anniversary of his death. We'll never know nuts and bolts of his life, but you've got to believe that this was someone who thought deeply, profoundly about every aspect of what it means to be human, from the joys to the worm of envy to, and that's why 400 years later we still want to read it, because it is profoundly honest, besides being beautifully written. And also, could the guy have just saved a few words and phrases for the rest of us? Did he have to steal all the really great ones?
Yeah, but they're so easy to steal and make into something else. One last quick question, and then we're going to sell books, if there's one. Really? I'm always shocked when nobody asks questions, because I always think they're meant. Oh, please, yes.
I'm just thinking about the impact that I know your books had on me, and back in those days, and how important it was. And I feel some responsibility for the young women that stand on my shoulders, and thinking about who their heroine is now. I don't even know that this is a question, but
Yeah, it's a good question, and they're changing, they're evolving, they're exciting. The young women that I meet, I don't meet enough of them, don't have enough to do with them. I think some of the dystopic heroines, like the ones in the Hunger Games, are interesting and strong models that we didn't have growing up. It also troubles me. I think that my expectation was there would be less self-doubt, less harassment, more bold striding on the stage than there is now. And so, like the woman who posed the question, I think people my age have a huge responsibility to keep doors open, keep a hand out to all young people, but especially to young women who may come to us.
I think that's a perfect place to thank Sara for being so honest.